Welcome to Talking Absolute Worship. I gave you fair warning last week that this week was to be the last appearance of Neil and Lithan. They have been with us since the very first episode of Talking Absolute Worship, when we used to have 5 participants and it used to go on for half a day, or felt like it at the time. And look at that, they're still both as fresh as when we began, whereas I look as rough as a part of a badger that I probably shouldn't mention this morning.
But then you always did.
Age has not corrupted them in 3 years of lectionary discussion. I know we're in for a treat. They've got to fit into this session every last thing they ever want to say on Talking Absolute Worship, whether it relates to the readings or not. But Lithan has to be away in an hour and a quarter. So we have got a pair of brackets. Do not fear. Neil's going to go first. We're looking at the readings for Proper 27. And there are some familiar words in here and some less familiar ones. But Neil has got some really insightful things to say. He's been researching virgins, I believe. So, Neil, how can you help us preach these texts?
Thank you. Yes. So I mean, one of the first big decisions that I guess all of us will be making is the way in which we're going to handle Remembrance and Remembrance Sunday, this being the Sunday closest to Remembrance Sunday. So many of our lectionaries actually offer an entirely, fresh alternative set of readings that we may go to for Remembrance Sunday. Some of us may be doing acts of worship in which there's a whole load of other people, the Royal British Legion and so on, and there's just a load of other stuff that will shape the worship. So, I mean, I think we just need to recognize that. So I'm going to dive into some of the lectionary texts that are set that, in a sense, don't necessarily have an eye on Remembrance Sunday, but I think can be used and drawn upon. And I guess one of the things that I'm struck by is if we start with the Matthew text, so we're in Matthew 25, and we've got the 10 bridesmaids waiting, and 5 of them have got everything organized, and they've got their lamps and their lamp oil, and 5 of them are not so well prepared, and they get disappointed because there is a delay. And we are in this text, and I think also in the Thessalonians text, and indeed, if depending on where you go in the lectionary, you could also find yourself with Amos chapter 5 and the day of the Lord. We're in sort of apocalyptic mode. We're in texts that look to the end of time or the end times. And we're also dealing with one of our favorite chestnuts as preachers, eschatology. And some of us well remember writing essays about eschatology and not necessarily even understanding the title of the essay, let alone, or that maybe that was just me. But anyway.
Is that where you try and get out of handcuffs with a bag over your head?
Yes, exactly. Right. So one of the things that I think, so we have got some quite strange texts, and we need to allow them to be in their context. So we need them to this might be a moment, and this is why I think we need to be very conscious that it is Remembrance Sunday. We need to perhaps be conscious that these texts speak into a context of faith in, for example, with perhaps the Thessalonians text, the idea that Jesus is going to return very soon, and we are living between the times, but we're not living, it's not going to go on for thousands of years. It's going to go on for a generation or so. And what do we do with the fact that some Christians are dying and Jesus hasn't returned? And in the Matthew text, we've got this strong sense that you know, perhaps the groom is Christ and he is going to come back. And some people will be ready for his return and other people won't be ready. And with the Amos text, we've got this, the day of the Lord as being something that will surprise us, that will be frightening, that will, you know, we think we've escaped from one sort of disaster only to encounter a different disaster. So I think one of the things for the preacher to do is to try and work out to what extent do I need to help a congregation enter into the world of apocalyptic and eschatology in order for this to kind of start to make some sense for us? And I suppose the thing that I started to wonder about that might connect this into remembrance is that we talk a lot, I think, about particularly the First World War was seen as being, you know, the war to end all wars. And there was a sense that the carnage was so appalling that surely it would be inconceivable that we would do this again. And of course, within a generation, we are doing it again. And then, of course, on any Remembrance Sunday, hopefully we will not just be remembering those who might be on the war memorial of our churches, and I minister in churches that have war memorials that have the list of names of those who went to 2 world wars. But there will be other people in the congregation who will have connections to perhaps Vietnam or Korea or the Falklands or Northern Ireland or more recently Afghanistan and Iraq, and so it goes on. And in our prayers we would be remembering wars that are raging even now, Ukraine and Yemen and Sudan and so on. And I suppose one of the things that I'm perhaps going to be dwelling upon is that we live in a world in which things are unpredictable, in which we think we have seen something that is the end of everything, but in fact it isn't. And that life continues and the world continues to turn, and it has an element of unpredictability to it. It is fragile. We can't control. There is so much that we cannot control. And I think these are texts that, amongst other things, are saying to us, be ready and be aware of the fact that things may not always work out neatly the way you expect them to, even when it comes to your theology and your belief in what it is that God is going to do. You will be surprised, and you may need to be more patient than you ever thought possible. And I think of, you know, I think of those whose stories I have encountered as a minister, those who went to war, believing passionately that they were entering into something that would make the world a better place. And in many ways it did. I mean, I think of some of the scenes of the liberation of the prison camps, you know, and the ending of the evil of what the Nazis were doing was so significant. But many of our wars are much more ambivalent and ambiguous. I think of a friend, you know, we all know on this particular recording, we have a friend who trained with us at Mansfield who has been an army chaplain and served in Afghanistan. And what must it feel like to have ministered to those who were giving their lives in order to try, they believed, I think, very passionately, in order to give Afghanistan a chance to be, you know, to be a different place. And here we are with the Taliban, you know, back in control, and indeed the lives of women and others being devastated by that. So I think what we get in these passages is we get the warning that the world is not as we want it to be, and that our job is to be faithful in the midst of the chaos of it, And I think the other thing that they're saying to us is we need to draw on the resources that faith offers us, because God is at work even in the chaos. And God is inviting us and calling us to be faithful and to be ready for the long haul. And that is true of nations trying to build a better world and a more just world. And in many ways, we are way further on than the world of 1914. But in other ways, the world remains as divided and as broken as can be. And then I think perhaps you could bring it much closer to home. I think, for example, of how in most congregations, there will be people who are faithfully walking alongside someone who has a chronic illness, or who is dealing with dementia. My stepmother had dementia for 10 years. And my father walked with her, and the congregation walked with her for 10 years. And that may be, that's much less dramatic than going off to war. Of course it is. But in other ways, in terms of what it does inside a person and what it does inside a family, that is a battle as ferocious as any that any human being can enter into. And so we might be preaching a sermon that touches on the fragility of life, how much is lost along the way amongst nations and in congregations, and what does it mean to be faithful and persistent in prayer and in love and in compassion. And those might be some of the ways in which I'd be trying to connect these particular readings and into Remembrance Sunday.
Thank you, Neil. I think that's a particularly powerful way of connecting these readings to remembrance. Given your interpretation there, I don't think there's any need to go looking for other readings for remembrance, because I think you've tied that up really, really well with a message that everybody in the congregation will recognize. There probably isn't a congregation where they don't recognize what you said, in both respects, in terms of World Wars I and II and other conflicts, particularly Afghanistan. Not many congregations are completely untouched by that one.
Yeah.
I know mine are touched by that one, and walking with somebody with a chronic illness or condition, again, I can't imagine a congregation that doesn't recognize that. It's kind of very Adventy, isn't it? I know Advent isn't far off, but this reading just feels very Adventy to me. This wait. There's like there's a theme of waiting in there, isn't there? Which we will major on in Advent, or at least we would if we were bothering to do Year C again, but we're not. So by the end, you'll have to go back to the beginning and see what we were talking about back then if you want to know what happens in Advent. Although we will be blarping on about COVID most of the time for the first few sessions. But that thing will come out soon. It's probably not a bad idea to start getting the congregation into that zone. And of course, the Advent readings are very apocalyptic, aren't they? So I can see that resonating quite deeply with congregations. Lithan, what kind of direction were you led in?
In the last place where I was minister, this was the most popular service of the year. Christmas had nothing on the amount of people that would come for Remembrance Sunday. Yeah. And I've always been trying to work out, why is that? Now, partly it was that lots of ex-military people, that there's an extra, you can get a new house, there's a good mortgage scheme, or there was. So there were quite a lot of young ex-military in Cranbrook, and that always made it feel very different from remembering past, when the past was sooner. But I think what Neil said is really helpful, because these are not easy readings for unchurched people. Right, any of them, they all will need a lot of unpacking to try and make sense of. And I think maybe if I was there, I wouldn't be using any of them. And because sometimes if the lectionary doesn't work, we don't have to use the lectionary. I did wonder about Thessalonians, whether it could be something that would lead into a discussion about grief and fear about what next. Again, I'm not sure how easy that would be with those who have little understanding of the Bible. But I think that time because I wonder if for some people that's the main thing that Remembrance Sunday is. It's become the time when we remember those we've lost, and it's tied into thinking about those who died in war. But I wonder if there's something deeper and collective going on. I was at a church here a couple of years ago on Remembrance Sunday, and we had lunch afterwards. And interestingly, the church hadn't kind of recognized or said, let's be a part of the civic remembrance thing. But that finished just after I left the church, and I had to wait for ages as hordes of people crossed the path of where I wanted to turn left. It was only about 10 minutes, but it felt like forever. And just thinking, we sat in church, and it was good. And, I think we felt that we remembered in the right way, but shouldn't we have been with everybody else?
Yeah.
Why is it that we're doing this all? And again, that thing of what is it that means that instead of it dwindling, remembrance has become more and more important for British people. That's not really explaining anything about the text, but I just think it's useful when we're all preparing. Again, context is important for us. And I read some stuff. Someone pointed me to what N.T. Wright said. I think he is N.T. Wright at this point. Those of us who are at Mansfield together will recall that as N.T. Wright, he would lecture in ways that were quite hard to fathom, and as Tom Wright, he makes it a lot easier. But I think this is Paul for everyone. So I think actually this is Tom Wright, which is a relief to me.
Give us your Lithan Nevard rather than your L.E. Nevard.
Yeah. And he says, here's the thing about this reading that we need to start with, and I think this is quite captivating for me. How do you describe the colour blue to someone who's never been able to see? How do you even convey the idea of colour? And then think about Paul going to Thessalonica, and he wants to tell them about what's going to happen when the Lord comes back, because at that time they're thinking it's going to be soon, because some people have died and others aren't sure what to believe about where these people are and what will happen to them. And he wants them to learn what Tom Wright calls appropriate Christian grief, rather than the hopeless mourning that you'd get in pagan funerals. And so he's trying to explain what happens when God makes this new world. And the only language he can find is that of pictures. And so, and the trouble is that when he's describing blue, we take it as literal, is Tom Wright's argument. So, and particularly Christians have got stuck on those verses from 16 and 17, that the dead are finally going to rise, and Tom Wright says he's not talking literally here. He's trying to describe the way to say we don't have to worry about what's happened to those before or after. What's important is we're all going to be together with God, that it's not some kind of science fiction rising into the sky thing that we need to worry about. But what he's using is the language from Daniel 7 about that those who've been waiting persecution and awaiting God's vindication, this will come. And I kind of think that's quite helpful to say then what we can be confident about is God's future purposes for all those who have died. There's grief, but there's also hope. There's a day when God will right wrongs and grief will turn into joy. And Jesus is central to all of that because he's the hope that we cling to. That's still quite difficult stuff, I think, for unchurched people. And so I probably would avoid it, but I just wonder whether if it's your regular congregation actually tapping into that, what does grief mean and where do we get stuck with it? And sometimes readings like this can make people feel worse rather than better, and say, that's, you know, what you've read, that's not exactly what Paul's he's trying to offer comfort and explain it will all be okay, but in a way that we've taken as literal. And then we've got the bridesmaids, and I think I'd probably go with what Neil said, to be honest. But we might also
Always wise.
we might also want to talk about that what the bridesmaids were there for were to be bringers of light. So they're there to light the way for the bridegroom. And again, I always feel they could have shared. Surely there was a way the others could have shared. But I guess if they knew they only had enough light to be able to spare light for themselves, and that would mean everyone would be in darkness, I guess I'd understand that. But it's that waiting is really hard and often tinged with anxiety. And last time we preached this, we were in the middle of COVID. We were in that weird place where we'd had the big lockdown, hadn't we? And then we'd come out, and then we were heading into, there was the Christmas happened again. So we were kind of wondering what was going to be happening. And all of that waiting with anxiety, if people didn't understand that before, I think living through lockdown's a reminder of what it means to be anxiously waiting. And that what do we need then as light bringers to be able to offer that light where it's needed? And perhaps it is about being people who are prepared. And I like the fact that in scouting, you know, the motto is be prepared. And Baden-Powell was asked be prepared for what? And he said, for anything, or for any old thing. You know, that's what you need to be prepared for anything. But particularly for us, if we're going to be the light bringers, we need to be prepared when that happens. And that's about trying to make sure that we're people of resilience, even when we're living with anxiety and we're not sure about the future. Where can we draw resilience from? And that's from the light of Jesus. And also about so it's like the song, give me oil in my lamp, keep me burning. That's the point of it, that we can find restoration. And so we will need things in our cupboard that will help us to do that. Having a cupboard full of prayer and conversation and Bible study that mean that we won't run out of that energy that we need. And we also need the hope that Jesus will come, because we have the hope that he has come. Now, and in our tradition, we don't talk about that very much, apart from at Advent. But as Christians, when we say Christ has died, Christ is risen, Christ will come again, that's an essential part of who we are. And that perhaps saying, yeah, but not yet. Or some days I go, I think it's going to have to be soon, because we're making such a bad job of this world. That's something that we might need to think about. But that hope of what we've had in Christ, what the Holy Spirit helps us with, and that promise for the future can help keep us going and keep us knowing that we never know. Be prepared for anything is what we need to be as Christians and as light bringers.
Thank you, Lithan. I think that's really helpful. Neil?
I think that's brilliant. I think that's really, really helpful. One of the commentaries that I was looking at on our 10 bridesmaids also made a point that I think, you know, amplifies something that you were mentioning, Lithan, which is that, yeah, you know, we kind of read it and think that's a bit mean. Why don't they share? But maybe the point that lies at the heart of that is that no one else can do your faith on your behalf. Yeah. You know, which I thought was quite a useful thing to hold on to. That, and then also, and I mean, this is a more difficult part of the story, that the door gets shut. That actually there is a moment beyond which the door is shut. And so you know, not putting off what does it mean to be a follower of Jesus. Now, of course, that can get dangerously, twisted, and that can be used in all sorts of ways to beat people up, theologically and spiritually. But I wonder again, if in our tradition, if maybe sometimes we need to be drawn up a bit short and challenged with the, this is, of course, it's about the world. Of course, it's about the community. Of course, it's about all of us. It's also about my soul. It's about me. And it's about, am I right with God? And no one else can do that except me. And other people can help me believe, and other people can support me, and other people can pray for me when I don't know what to pray. But actually, there is also, the danger is I just say, well, I can be sort of, other people can do Christianity on my behalf. And I think it's one of those interesting things that, I mean, you'll have probably encountered, as I have, that you get to that difficult moment when a church closes, and loads of people who have never been seen in this church come to the final service, and some of them get very uppity and upset and say, this is outrageous, how can this church must remain open. And kind of, as you talk through and you say, well, but I don't remember that you were part of helping us to keep this church going over the last however many years. And people will say, yes, but there needs to be a church. And it's kind of, it's that thing of, I don't necessarily want to commit to it myself, but I want it to be there, not least perhaps for Remembrance Sunday, or for funerals, or for weddings, and so on. And maybe there is something that Jesus is hammering away at that is about saying, this journey of faith is also intensely, powerfully personal, and you have to be accountable for that journey, each of you, which is not a comfortable thing, but it's maybe an important thing.
I think that's really helpful, because it's very easy to get stuck on why didn't they share, because it's exactly the kind of thing you'd expect Jesus to say, isn't it? To turn a story upside down and say, well, the one that came back and said thank you, or the one that shared her oil and then ran out herself, but Jesus let her in through the back door, sort of thing. I don't know, but you expect some kind of twist, don't you? But there isn't a twist in this one, which is really interesting. I think there are loads of tensions in this talk of apocalypse and Jesus coming, aren't there? I mean, and they're even there in the biblical text, where folk who think that Jesus is coming very, very imminently, there's a danger in that, because they stop living and stop engaging with the world, and then focus on, am I going to be on the right side when this day comes, kind of thing. And go up a mountain and say, now is the time, or whatever they do. Or they did with Peter Cook and Dudley Moore. But then there's the kind of the opposite danger of not really believing it's going to happen at all, which is the kind of opposite danger, which I think Lytton sort of picked up on really well. And you've got to actually believe that it is going to happen. You've got, otherwise, why would you live in such a way that you might be ready when the kingdom of God comes? That you might look as if, I wonder if sometimes a way to put it is not about being ready, because it's a difficult concept to think, how would I be ready for such a thing? I know the Bible, there's the previous story about the burglars, the thief in the night, isn't there? And you've got to be ready, but you can't stay up all night every night waiting for the thief in the night to come, can you? So I wonder sometimes whether it's a question, or I kind of like to turn the question slightly and say, are you living your life in such a way that you would welcome the second coming, or Jesus coming into the world in a different way again, or in a final way? And it kind of focuses my mind in thinking there are people like us who, somebody said, well, would you be happy if Jesus, if Jesus came back tomorrow, and my instant thought would be, no, I want to see my kids grow up. No, I want to have a bit of retirement. I want to have a bit more time enjoying retirement with Lithan, maybe, and there'll be all sorts
What
of
do you
things.
mean,
Maybe. Well, maybe.
These kind of options.
I might edit that out. Maybe. If we get to retire, that is, yes, that's. And I could think of all sorts of reasons, but the reason I can think of all sorts of reasons is because I live a very privileged Western life.
Yeah.
There are people all around the world who live lives of grinding poverty, who would welcome the kingdom of God arriving in this second final form, in its final state. If it happened in 10 minutes' time, they would welcome it. They'd be ready for it because it's got to be better than life now. I kind of wonder whether it's a sharper question to say, are you living your life in such a way that you would welcome this, that you actually want this to happen? Because I'm not sure I do, to be honest. If I'm really honest with myself, I'd quite like a few more years of my life on Earth, and seeing how it pans out and watching my children grow, and maybe one day having grandchildren, that kind of stuff. And I've got plans. I've got plans. God interrupting them with the Perusia. Or the rapture, or whatever that looks like. So I think there's a tension in there, and maybe a question to be asked about whether we actually want it to happen. Did all those 10 really want the bridegroom to arrive, or was it just, was it some of that? We've got better stuff to do anyway. I quite like what you said about Thessalonians, listen, because I made a little note alongside my printing out of the Thessalonians passage to try and sum up Thessalonians. And it says, don't worry, guys, the dead will rise first, which it doesn't sound like something people worry about in the 21st century, but I think you've helped me understand that when you were talking about how much more important remembrance has become. And I think there's something significant in there about all of us wanting to attach meaning to life. And particularly when someone dies, we want their life to have been meaningful. We want and that's what Neil was saying about, this is the First World War. It was awful. It was grim. And there's no way you can even begin to try and understand that unless you believe that it was for a purpose. And if you end up saying it was all a waste, how devastating is that to someone's life? And the same with, as Neil was saying, the more the wars with much vaguer outcomes, for those who've come back scarred by those conflicts, or for their family who have lost them, saying, actually, we've lost them for no reason. It was meaningless. How devastating is that? We all want life. So I wonder if that's something to do with how we see remembrance and how we see wanting to cling on to life being purposeful and life having meaning, and people having left a mark and their lives having been truly valuable and impactful. But I ended up where I usually go when there's parables, in Susan Derber's book, Surprised by Grace. I usually let Susan have the last word when it comes to parables, and she's quite cheeky about them quite often. I mean, she says, well, never mind criticizing these 10 young women. It's really the bridegroom's fault for being so chuffing late, isn't it? If he hadn't been late, it wouldn't have been a problem, would there? Yet we're focusing on, these girls, they should have had more oil. But actually, it's just the bloke's fault, isn't it, for being so late? Because if he hadn't been, well, then there wouldn't have been an issue. So let's not blame the young girls here for being stupid. Let's blame the bridegroom for being late. And then she said, well, maybe let's not always predominantly think of the bridegroom as being Jesus, and then it releases us a bit from feeling too guilty about thinking that. But the place that she settles, I think, is quite helpful. Well, it would be, it's Susan. So the place she settles, and I just wanted to pick out one sentence. She said, maybe this is a story that encourages the hearer to avoid the cynical viewpoint that nothing good will ever happen. I think that is such a useful way of looking at this. Maybe we're being encouraged by Jesus to avoid the cynical view or the cynical lifestyle that gets itself to the position where we believe that nothing good will ever happen. And you can expand that. The bridegroom's never going to arrive is the one in this story. But whatever it is, we just believe cynically that everything's going down the pan. And we end up living our lives in that way. And so she goes on to say, maybe this is in a non-trite way, because it can be said in a very trite way, in a non-trite way, the kind of story that helps us to think about living our lives as if they were coming to an end. And what would we want them to look like? And people often say, if this was the last day of your life, and then all sorts of fanciful things are said, aren't they? And people say, well, I rob a bank, or I act in a completely selfish manner because I need to drain every last bit of personal enjoyment out of it that I possibly could. But as Christians, Howard, if it was the last day of my life, I'd want to make sure that I went out on a note of sacrifice and goodness. And would we? And Susan's suggesting that maybe this is a parable that says maybe we should always be thinking that we're living in the last days, and it is our last opportunity to show people what the kingdom of heaven looks like in the way that we're living. And she does offer a prayer, which maybe I'll say in part 2 when we talk about other things that we can do about what the last day of our lives might look like if you took the parable in that way. So yeah, I think that's where I go, and I don't think any of us is saying anything different, really. There's a lot to be said here about death, about remembrance, about our own life, and about the way we live our lives. Nothing at all about virgins. So there you go. All that research was pointless, Neil. Young women, bridesmaids. I don't know what the correct translation is. What is the correct translation?
Bridesmaids will do.
Bridesmaids. Fair enough. It's not called, yeah, fair enough. So, fortunately, there's other stuff that we can do that is not preaching or escapology, as Neil was telling us earlier on. There's other stuff that we can help our congregation engage with these texts. So, Neil, what have you come up with?
So I'm afraid I'm going to be boringly predictable. So I've got one thing, and I honestly can't remember now. We've been doing this for so many years. I can't remember if I've ever done one that was leading us into Remembrance Sunday. So forgive me if I am basically a one-trick pony and I'm going to do my one trick again. But if you're wanting something that is about remembrance, and that maybe just gives it a different element, I wonder how many of us have come across the remarkable recording that exists of the sound of the armistice. During the First World War, one of the things that the military did was they set up microphones on the front lines, and they used the difference between the flash of the gun and when the sound recording picked up the sound of the gun. If you do that in all sorts of ways in different places, you can really get a good idea of how far away the guns were. And if you want to find this, it's readily available. You just need to go on YouTube and put in Imperial War Museum sound of the end of World War I, and you get this, which is thought-provoking. So here we go. So on the Imperial War Museum, they have this recording.
Wow, that's really powerful. Then when the birds come in, it just sends
Yeah,
a
I
shiver
mean,
down your
they
spine,
do.
doesn't it?
If you read the stuff, they do. So I mean, what they have is they have that trace. Oh my goodness me, is that my machine?
No, there's nothing
Might
weird
be
going
quite
on
the
our
only thing.
screens.
Oh, okay. So yeah, I think it's, it is about that sense of um, the trace is the piece of paper,
Mm,
and they've a company have kind of taken original recordings from the First World War and they fitted them to the trace. So there's a little bit of poetic license, but nevertheless, I think, I mean, when I've used it on a Remembrance Sunday, just as a way of kind of trying to just somehow enter into the sheer
mm.
overwhelming sense of what it meant that at the 11th hour on the 11th day, this thing stopped. Just, yeah. So that's one thing. And then this
Is there
being,
any commentary in there about what was happening with those guns? Because the question that comes into my head is that they knew this was going to happen. They knew it was going to end at 11, and yet they were still firing. Were
oh,
they firing
absolutely.
into the air, or were they still
No,
trying to
that's
kill each
that,
other desperately until the 11th hour?
Yeah, no, I think absolutely. It's about continuing. It was about continuing to fire and fight. And
How horrific is that? If we
there's that
know it's about to
I know
end, and,
there's
and
that
we're not going to
incredibly
stop in 1 minute, we'll get as much killing in as we can before it stops. It's
there's that amazing film, German film that's came out recently. I think is it called The
on
Western
the
Front?
Western Front. Yeah.
Which and it's exactly that, isn't it? That literally I mean, not to do a spoiler, but it's worth watching because the film is exactly about that point. That even at the end, people are throwing everything they've got into attacking one another. And then there is just this bizarre, literally one moment we're trying to kill each other, the next moment we're not. It's just, I mean, it's mind-boggling. So
thank you.
this being the last time I will do this, you won't be surprised to know that the final thing I would love us to do is to have something to put on a fridge.
Ka-ching.
So I was thinking, because it's always fun to have something to take away from worship. And I was thinking about these readings and I was thinking about Remembrance Sunday and, what might be something that the congregation could all have that you take home. And actually, what I started to play around with was, I guess, quite heavily influenced by the Matthew text. I started to think about some of the ways in which we try to get ready for things. And I thought about to-do lists, and I thought about shopping lists, and I thought about gift lists. And what if you were to find a way for everyone in the congregation to get a piece of paper or a piece of card that has those headings that remind us of all the ways in which we try to get ready for things and we don't want to forget anything. And so we write it down and we make a list. But what if actually that becomes a list of what are the things that God is gifting you with right now? Things that perhaps you haven't noticed. What if today you might just, there might be a little text from the Bible on that list that is a little word of blessing for you today and in the days ahead as it sits in your kitchen on the fridge? What if it's got a question like how, some of the questions, Phil, you were asking, am I ready? How am I using the time that I've got? How am I going to use today? What is it that God is showing me? And it just seemed to me we could, and indeed, maybe it's also about remembrance. What am I remembering today? Who am I remembering today? How am I remembering? But it just seemed to me that playing around with that notion of the way in which we make lists so that we don't forget things might lend itself to something that a congregation could take away as a reminder of this worship and these texts.
Thank you, Neil. I feel that the circle of life is complete. Have something to stick on the fridge, and our time here is done. Thank you. That's fantastic. Lithan, what have you got in your little rucksack of ideas for? What are your greatest hits for Remembrance Sunday?
Well, Remembrance Sunday, there's all sorts of things. So what I've got a less Remembrance Sunday-ish, really, but still might be worth using. And they are some of the greatest pantomime hits. And have I frozen?
No, you're fine. It's just that your husband seems to have walked away, but yes. I would press on.
I will press on. So here we have. So to start with, let's do slideshow. Oh, I didn't press the sound thing. Never mind. If I'd pressed the sound, you'd be able to hear. This is the Matthew reading from Lumo.
At that time, the kingdom of heaven will be like 10 virgins who took their lamps and went out to meet the bridegroom. 5 of them were foolish and 5 were wise.
And I think that sometimes having an acted out version of a Bible story can be helpful. And as I said before about Lumo, they use the actual Bible. They don't make it a drama. Now I've got and here's another of my favorites, is using the paintings from Jesus Maffa. And again, I like this one because the faces, there's just so much to see about how they're looking, and the happy ones and the upset ones and all the other people coming, and it could be a good way into helping to describe the story. And finally, so this is our oldest at 10 months old. We'd gone on holiday and we were out for the day. We brought his hat, the buggy, the changing mat, a high chair. We'd gone out for the day and we'd taken a high chair, but we didn't take him any food. So this is his first encounter with and at 10 months, he wasn't eating that much kind of solid food. So I remember we gave him a little bit of a sandwich that we thought would be safe. And then he enjoyed his first Kit Kat. So he wasn't actually upset that we weren't prepared. But it's an illustration of, you can bring the kitchen sink, but it might not be that. You've got to be prepared with the right things, because we could have done without a high chair. What were we thinking? But food is the essential, and maybe there's something that will help us in that. So let's just find another couple of quick ideas. You could prepare everyone that an alarm's or a buzzer's going to go off in worship, and when that happens they have to do something, but they're never going to know when it's going to be. So that's that interesting thing about having to wait but not know when. Possibly for now, or possibly for Advent, give everyone a square of chocolate and they have to put it on their tongue and see how long they can wait before either it just gets horrible or they just have to eat it. And I say it could be for Advent, in saying Advent's actually waiting with intention, not just waiting for, it's an active waiting, but you might want to have that for here. You could do it twice if you like chocolate.
Thank you, Lithan. Yes, that photograph always makes its appearance on Howell's birthdays, doesn't it? Well, it certainly did a few days ago when it was Howell's birthday. The photo reappears. It's fabulous. So, not being ready. It might be worth just engaging people with that story and what are ways that you've turned up somewhere and not been ready in the most obvious way. I'm sure there's plenty of stories. People who've got everything packed up ready for a holiday and ended up at the ferry port, and then the ferries are on strike, and then they have a whole day in the car park, and you're not ready. You're not prepared for it. Well, why would you be? It's not the sort of thing that you prepare for, is it? But there you go. With this story, again thinking of children, because I will be with children, but not in church, because on the Sunday closest to Remembrance in Sawston, there's a massive village remembrance thing that has converging processions from all over the place, and I usually have to go up to the school where all of the children in Sawston gather at the school, and I have to give them a little pep talk about remembrance. So I will be doing something with children. My inclination this year is to say, on your marks, get 2 or 3 kids out at the front and say, well, we're going to have a race all around the edge of the assembly hall or something, and see who can win it. And I'll line them up and I'll say, on your marks, get set, and then I'll turn to the rest of the congregation and say, oh, by the way, and then I'll talk about remembrance for about 10 minutes. And then I'll just keep according to I see what the other ones are doing who are set, and then I'll just say go at the end. But some of them may have given up by then, and some of them may not. So that'll be the little gimmick that I use. I'm going to have to do that because I used my top gimmick last year, and they remember it. So I'll swap you, Neil, your top gimmick for my top gimmick, which is to do the old stuff in a bag thing that you do with kids, and you have a load of random stuff in a bag. And you get all the bits out and ask them to remember all the stuff in the bag, and then you're going to put it all back in the bag and see if they can remember what was in the bag. And they're usually quite good at it, especially if you've got a massive room full of kids, and you go through it all and you get all the stuff out the bag, and then you say, well, there's one more thing that you can't remember, and they'll start guessing all the things they've already got out. So let it drift on for a bit, and nobody will guess. And then you fish out something that you never showed them. And they are outraged. Absolutely, kids just get outraged about anything that's unfair, and then talk about what it means to remember something that you never saw, that you were never part of. That is a collective memory. And it's a bit weird to ask a child to remember the Second World War, but it isn't. And then to sort of explain why it isn't, because it's a collective memory that we pass on from year to year. It's the memory of a nation. So I can't do that because I did that last year and they remember it. Well, ironically. Now I've got little objects. I have got 2 of these. These are tank shells that have been fashioned into little vases. This one, I think I had when a church closed down, and I found it in their cupboard when they were clearing the church, and I thought, that's a tank shell, I'll have that. So that came from a closed down church. I've got a bigger one that I bought off eBay. They're quite plenteously available, and they're a really good illustration to have about turning swords into plowshares, that kind of stuff. And I also have one of these, which is quite cool, which is one of those little lamps. This is obviously an original one that's been dug up on a very famous archaeological site. And you could light one. You could, if you really wanted to, experiment with it and not have enough oil and have it go out before the end of the service or something. I don't know. You'd need to carefully time that as to how much oil you needed and how much long it would keep burning, or just to have one, just to illustrate the story. They're not expensive. You can get hold of these quite easily, and they're a good thing to have in your tucker bag. So I think that's where I'd be going. And then I did say I'd read Susan's poem, Susan's prayer, because there's lots of mawkish stuff about your last day. The last thing you'd expect Susan to be is mawkish, and she's not. I think this is a very helpful way of thinking about if this day is to be my last day. So her prayer goes like this. Loving God, if this day is to be my last day, let it be filled with dancing and joy and love, and let me start the music. If this day is to be my last day, let forgiveness be given and received, and give me grace to be the one to begin. If this day is to be my last day, let the most important things find their true place and help me to know what they really are. If this is to be my last day, let me do something wonderful and good that will make a difference to someone somewhere. If this day is to be my last day, may there be silence and peace for a moment, that your presence may be known and felt. And if this day is not to be my last day, then let it be like this anyway, and teach me how to be ready for my dying, that my living may be more lovely in all the days I have. As you'd expect, you can't go wrong with a bit of Susan. Can you? That's Susan Derber from Surprised by Grace. I love the way she says, and let me be the one that starts it is her emphasis, rather than if it's my last day, I want to suck all the life out of it. That kind of thing. So yeah, there's a load of ideas. Is anyone itching to say something that hasn't been said? And now really is the last chance for you ever to say it.
Well, just thank you, Phil, for coming up with this mad idea and seeing it through for the 3 years of the lectionary. I know that I find it a really useful resource to go back to and hear different people's perspectives helps me when I'm leading worship. So I'm really grateful for all that you've put into this.
Yeah.
Thank you. You two have been stalwarts from day one, without whom this would never have lasted as long as it has. So yeah, thank you both for everything that you've offered through Talking Absolute Worship. It's been great, but that's enough.
when do we see the fees?
They're being calculated.
Okay.
I'll draw your attention to 1 Thessalonians 4, 13 to 18.
Yeah, it's a bad thing to wear collars and preach for a fee. Okay, we've been talking absolute worship. I'm going to ask Lithan to lead us in prayer as we crack on and try and prepare our acts of worship for this coming Sunday. Thank you, Lithan.
Loving God, we thank you that you have called us to be those who break open your word. So as we reflect on these readings, and particularly on what they have to say to us on Remembrance Sunday, we pray that through our words, more of your light, more of your hope, more of your peace can be found. We offer all that we are up to you, in thanks for your love and mercy and grace for us. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen.
Amen.